Good morning, everybody. On the 19th of September 2023, which is just about a month before I'm making this video, Azerbaijan invaded Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, you may have never heard of Nagorno-Karabakh. It is an Armenian enclave within the nation of Azerbaijan that had autonomy, a de facto autonomy. And it's been disputed since the breakup of the Soviet Union. Armenia wanted to bring Nagorno-Karabakh fully into the nation of Armenia and claim it as Armenian territory, as an integral part of the nation. The problem is, though, it is an exclave. It's very close to Armenia main, but it doesn't border it. It's surrounded completely by Azerbaijan in the main, and it's considered internationally as part of Azerbaijan, although Azerbaijan didn't have any rule there because it was essentially autonomous, because the only people that lived there were 120,000 Armenian Christians in Azerbaijan, which is largely a Muslim nation. So on the 19th of September, Azerbaijan went in and ethnically cleansed Nagorno-Karabakh. Hundreds of Armenian Christians were killed, and 120,000 of them have mostly fled into Armenia main. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, as I've said, the two different countries have wanted to do two different things. Armenia wanted to claim it, Azerbaijan wanted to ethnically cleanse it, and they did so. And they did so with weapons supplied to them by Israel. This was hardly mentioned. The whole incident was hardly mentioned in the mainstream media, let alone given 24/7 top priority coverage for weeks and weeks on end. Because the mainstream media does not consider 120,000 Armenians who have been killed and ethnically cleansed important. They're not bothered about it. They don't care. There are nearly 36 conflicts going on in the world at the moment. That was just one of them. The aftermath is still being felt as the last Armenian Christians who are there are leaving and going to live in Armenia. But there are conflicts happening in Yemen, in central Nigeria, in Ethiopia, Eritrea, in Burma, in the Philippines, in southern Thailand, in Congo, and many other places. How many of you have heard of anything about them on the mainstream media? You may have heard a little bit on occasion about the conflicts in Kashmir and Niger, but not much. The only two conflicts that the mainstream media is concerned with are the conflicts in Ukraine, although they've largely dropped that now because there is the new conflict in Israel-Palestine. And that is being given top priority 24/7 coverage. It's just, whatever is happening on both sides, there are people suffering, are innocent people suffering on both sides of every single conflict in the world that is going on, unquestioningly. And, innocent people always get caught up in these conflicts. And we need to do whatever we can to de-escalate every single conflict that is happening. It would be wonderful to have a world where there was no conflict and there was no war, and everyone could live in peace and security. That's not the world we live in at the moment, because there are people who are deliberately stoking up chaos all over the world. And that's no different in the Ukraine conflict to the Israel-Palestine conflict. But you're being manipulated. And what is disappointing is that people who have lived through the last 3 years, where we have come to an understanding that the government and the mainstream media is manipulating you all the time with behavioural psychology units and the very, very finest, most developed, most advanced and refined propaganda and manipulation techniques to control what you think, to get you to think in a certain way about a certain issue over the lockdown period and over the period where people were being injected. It's disappointing that people who understand that are now falling into the manipulation which is happening over the current conflict, and were to a large extent over the Ukraine conflict. People are beginning to see that they were manipulated about that, and people who put up blue and yellow flags all over the place are now taking them down because there's a new latest thing. But we need to understand that you are being manipulated hugely and massively without, in a way, and it's done in a way that, of course, they don't tell you that they're manipulating you, but they're trying to get you to feel something about a particular side in the conflict. Now, I completely understand with the Israel-Palestine conflict that if you are Jewish, you will probably support Israel. I mean, that's okay, that's understandable. And if you're Arab, you will probably support Palestine because they are your brethren. That's totally understandable. What is not understandable is that Anglo-Saxons, Scandinavians, German people, Slavic people, African people, African Americans, whatever, are feeling a visceral attachment to one or other side in this conflict, which really has nothing to do with us in the collective West or Russia or China or Africa. Israel, Palestine is a very, very small area. The whole geographical size of Israel is about the size of Wales, and the Gaza Strip is roughly half the size of Anglesey, although it's very, very highly densely populated. I mean, if you imagine, it's as populated as if you imagine the whole population of Wales was forced to go and live in the northern half of Anglesey, for example. That's how densely populated Gaza is. And they're not allowed to leave, and they're not allowed to trade with the world either. If they try to swim out to somewhere else, they'll be shot by a gunboat. And if they only allowed in things which obviously the Israeli government says they can bring in this boat, but they can't bring in that boat with supplies and so on. So they're not allowed to trade with the world. They're reliant entirely on aid. So that's Gaza and how big it is, and the relatively size of Israel. But everybody in the world is seemingly being manipulated to take a side. And this is deliberate. And this is not just something that has happened just now at the start of the conflict. The groundwork to manipulate people into feeling something for a particular side over and above the other side has been laid for decades and decades and decades, because this is a conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians that has been going on for 75 years. Now, up until now, I have made a distinct point of not commenting on Middle East politics because it is an absolute minefield, and I care about my country. I'm obviously a leader of the Heritage Party in the UK. We're standing in elections and fighting elections in the UK. I care about the UK and getting our country on the right path again. I'm not concerned about other countries and conflicts around the world apart from to try and de-escalate them where possible, to minimize death and suffering. That's all I'm concerned with, really. But it is very strange that Anglo-Saxons in the UK, and as I've said, other people who are not of the ethnic groups in Israel and Palestine, and not Jewish and not Arab, are taking sides in this and really viciously and viscerally putting their point across and supporting one side or the other. It doesn't make any sense. And the powers that be that create chaos in the world want everybody to take a side. They don't care, really, which side you take. So if you have been to an indoctrination centre, previously known as a university or a school, you will probably have been indoctrinated with critical race theory and cultural Marxism. And that will teach you that black people, brown people, ethnic people are oppressed by white supremacy and whiteness and white privilege. And so people who have been to a university, and you see in the Palestinian protests, many young people who have been indoctrinated by far left critical race theory and ideology coming out to support Palestine, because they have been indoctrinated to believe that the Palestinians are oppressed by Israel, by the Jews, because they're white, even though they're not, because they're Semitic rather than Caucasian. So, which it doesn't make any sense as either. But they come out supporting Palestine and wanting to decolonize Israel. And therefore they make the chant, from the river to the sea and all this, along with the Arabs, who you can understand supporting Palestine out on the street. So you have there many more white Anglo-Saxons indoctrinated by left-wing universities who are coming out to support Palestine in this conflict, rather than worrying about what's happening in their own country. On the other hand, you have people who are on the right, often, who have been indoctrinated with the neoconservatism, which is making an ugly comeback and rearing its ugly head again, that says the West should be the world's policeman and we must support freedom and democracy. And Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, so we must support Israel. And Israel is our West is on our side. There are guys in the Middle East against all the Muslim nations around us, because there's been 20 years of this fake war on terror, which has inculcated the belief in everybody that all Muslims all over the world, everyone who lives in the Middle East and North Africa, is a potential terrorist. Well, yeah, there are terrorists there, absolutely, but there are a lot of Christians who live in those nations as well. In Syria, in Iraq, in Iran. There are more Palestinian Christians than Israeli Christians, mostly in the West Bank, that there are 1,000 Christians still living in Gaza. And the third oldest church in the world is in Gaza. And one of its buildings was recently bombed in an Israeli air attack on Gaza. So you have people on generally the hard conservative right. Not me. No, I'm often called hard right, but I am anti-war as well. And so I'm not taking any sides in any foreign conflict. But there are people who are stoking this up. And obviously what happened on the 7th of October to the 1,200 Israelis who died when Hamas attacked them was absolutely horrific. Horrible. That should never happen to anybody, and the people that did that were responsible for it. But there was also the case that why was the security fence left unguarded at that time, when it's for 50 years it has been the most secure, impenetrable fence in the world, and suddenly on one day when this attack happened, it was left unguarded. And you've got to ask questions about that. Netanyahu is very unpopular in Israel himself. So, that you just got to put two and two together for some things. But there's something else happening as well, which I have started to mention in a couple of videos, and I think needs to be said again. But it may seem so bizarre and such a fringe issue to many people who are actually realizing this and the impact it has. But it really does need to be spoken about, because especially in America, a lot of the evangelical and Pentecostal churches, and there are tens of millions of evangelicals in America. Now, I'm an evangelical Christian in the sense that I believe the 5 solas of the Reformation: sola scriptura, sola gratia, sola fide, solus Christus, soli Deo gloria. You can look them up if you want to see. That's basically the essence and the foundation of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. I believe that. But I do not take on this new false teaching about the end times that is focused on the political nation of Israel and saying that certain things have to happen there before Christ comes back. And Christ can come back whenever he likes. He doesn't need mankind to do political machinations around the world to let him come back. His only instruction to the church is to preach the gospel in the whole world. But because of this false teaching, which has been injected into the Protestant or Reformed or Evangelical, Pentecostal, Charismatic churches, which in the UK may seem sort of a fringe part of society, although there are a few million people involved in it. In America, it's not. In America, it's mainstream and it affects politics greatly. I mean, a huge part of the Republican Party are involved in the evangelical churches. And the evangelical churches, while maintaining some good things from the Reformation, have been corrupted by this teaching of dispensationalism that comes from John Nelson Darby and was then propagandized and promoted by Cyrus Scofield with the Scofield Study Bible. This is a very important thing for you to understand, that this is not just something that affects the theology of a few people in evangelical churches. It's spread into secular politics and is now guiding and moving world events on to what is happening in Israel. And this is part of the manipulation of people to support Israel and come in on the side of Israel, and even to get people who are Christians and outside Christianity in politics to support the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, the rebuilding of the third temple in Jerusalem, and the re-establishment of animal sacrifices, beginning with the sacrifice of a red heifer on the Temple Mount and so on, to bring in the fulfillment of what is seen by people who've taken on Darby and Scofield's teaching as end times prophecy. And this is very, very dangerous, because it gets people who would normally be lovely and decent people who care for the world to actually want to accelerate this conflict into a nuclear World War III, because they believe this needs to happen before Christ comes back, because that's the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And it's not just people who are Christians, evangelical Christians mainly, who have taken this on, but you also have in the Talmud Jews, Orthodox Jews who believe the Talmud, which was written in the 2nd to 4th century AD, also believing that this has to happen. And then you have Muslims, Salafist Muslims, believing that the Mahdi is their Messiah, will come back when all kinds of things happen concerning the Muslims taking over what is Israel now, and ethnically cleansing that the other way, and removing all the Jews from Israel. So you've got one group of people believing for the Messiah to come back, you need to ethnically cleanse the land one way, and you've got Muslims, Salafist Muslims at least, believing they got to ethnically cleanse it the other way. And this is feeding into a lot of the propaganda that is going on. Crazy though that may seem to people who are not religious, who are secular, this is actually part of one, I would suggest, the main driving force behind people stoking up the chaos and the tension in Israel. Now, I mean, I can't speak to Jews, I can't speak to Muslims, but I am a Christian. I can speak to Christians, and I can speak to people in my country who are African, Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, Scandinavian, I mean, in the Western world in general. We need to reject this teaching, this false teaching that has been injected into the body of theology in the Protestant, Reformed, Evangelical, Charismatic, and Pentecostal churches that comes from Derby and is in the notes of the Schofield Study Bible. Because for the last 100 years or so, most Bible seminaries and evangelical institutes, and again, in the UK, this seem like a very fringe issue, but in the USA, it's not. There are tens of millions of people who go to church, who are taught by pastors, who have been to Bible seminaries that use the Schofield Study Bible with its false teaching, which is not in the text of the Bible, because it's the King James Bible, which is very good, but the notes underneath actually promote the nation state of Israel being formed and suggest that Christians must support Israel and you must support the Jews and you must, there has to be a rapture and a nuclear conflagration before Christ comes back. Absolute nonsense. And this is where it's coming from, and it's very dangerous because it's driving world events. And this is a manipulation that is happening through the churches which have received this corrupt teaching, which is spilling out into the wider world. We need to start understanding that. And that's why I've, for better or worse, am now given up my, maybe a wiser and safer course to not talk about the Middle East and what's going on. But it's really time to talk about not the Middle East itself, because it's impossible to unpack the conflict between Israel and Palestine, because, you say, well, this happened, but then someone says, well, that happened in 2010. Oh, well, that happened in the 1990s. Oh, well, this happened in the 1980s. Oh, but they did that in the 1960s. Oh, but something here happened in the 1940s. Well, we lived here in 200 years ago. Oh, we lived here 1,000 years ago. Oh, we lived here 2,000 years ago. And it just goes on and on. I mean, it's impossible to unpack. All I'm concerned about for the people that live there is that the conflict can stop and people can start to live together in peace, however that happens. And we need to remove the chaos mongers, both Hamas and the people in the Israeli government. And let's remember that both Hamas and the Israeli government terrorized their people during the COVID era. They injected them, they coerced people to be injected with this poison, this experimental injection, to the point where they said you cannot even go to a shop, you cannot travel unless you have an injection. And there were like beach. I remember seeing a picture from the beach in Israel, a beach where there were chairs there, and they said you can't sit on this chair unless you've had an injection. I mean, that is the medical apartheid that was used on their own people. So, innocent Israelis have been terrorized by their tyrannical government during that COVID era, and so were innocent Palestinians terrorized in the same way by the tyranny of the lockdown and the injection period in the Palestinian territories as well. So whether it's Hamas or whether it's the Israeli government, they don't care about their own people. I just want ordinary people to be able to get on and live their lives, which is, what most ordinary people want to do, without hatred being stirred up and without manipulation happening all over the place. But this week in London, we've seen that as well with the mainstream media. And there was a big Palestinian demonstration on Saturday, and then there was a big Israeli demonstration on a Sunday. And the narratives coming out from one side is, oh, look at them, they're all violent and aggressive and terrorists. And then the other side is like, well, look at them, and using these demonstrations to create and to embed the narratives and the feelings that people have about one side or against the other side, one side or the other. It's off the scale. And we need to recognize that at the moment, you are being manipulated by governments, by NGOs who are involved, who are sending the money around the place, by the military-industrial complex and their behavioural psychology units, which they are using against your mind. Your mind is part of the global battle over this conflict which is taking off. And the reason why it's in the media, top priority 24/7, in a way which the ethnic cleansing of Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh wasn't, is because they are invested in creating chaos and World War III so that they can bring in a global government which will get rid of nation states, get rid of property, essentially fulfill what was proposed in Marx's Communist Manifesto in 1848, and take away all your freedom that is left. So if you're wise, open your eyes to all the different levels of manipulation that are happening through the mainstream media and through the churches, the synagogues, the mosques in your countries, and choose the side of the people and peace over coming in and choosing to support one side of the military operation against the other side of the military operation, who are both funded by the same money men who have funded almost every single war that's happened in the last 200 years.